Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 396, Becoming Jewish, but not a Jew by choice. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing our series of episodes exploring conversion to Judaism. But before we do that, we want to remind you that it's time to sign up for the Unyeshiva's fall 12-week classes, which begin in early October. Remember, these are full semester, that's 12-week classes in our Unyeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. And this week, we're shining a special spotlight on a class called Embodied Jewish Transformation, Pathways of Possibility, which is taught by Yoshi Silverstein, the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective. He was our guest back in episode 360, so if you want to do a deep dive in understanding Mitsui Collective and Yoshi Silverstein's approach to building resilient community through embodied Jewish practice and somatic anti-racism, you can go listen to episode 360 of Judaism Unbound, and then you should immediately head to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up to spend 12 weeks with Yoshi Silverstein, which I can tell you is something you are going to be very grateful to have been able to do. Yoshi Silverstein's course is designed to guide students in an exploration of embodied Jewish practice. Together, you will study and apply key forms, patterns, and concepts from throughout Jewish history, from Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, a Kabbalistic work, to Hebrew scribal arts, to the Magen David, the six-pointed star or shield of David. If you take this class, you should expect to have a blend of ample embodied learning and practice, including physical movement, song, breath work, and other physical practices, alongside text study and intellectual exploration of key theoretical concepts and frameworks. The course is designed in general to be broadly accessible to people of all backgrounds, abilities, identities, and experience. All bodies are welcome. So to sign up for that class, head over to judaismunbound.com/classes. And like all Unyeshiva classes, there is a sliding scale that you can pay what you can afford. And if that sliding scale is beyond your reach, you can also apply for financial aid. We really want Unyeshiva classes to be available to everyone. And of course, if you can afford it and you pay the higher amounts, that actually is what helps us make these classes accessible to folks who cannot afford them. So whatever you're able to pay, we're grateful and we're thrilled, and we are really looking forward to having you as part of the Unyeshiva learning community. And now for today's episode. Our guest today, Amelia Dornbush, lives and works in Lansing, Michigan. She underwent a conversion when she was in college about a decade ago, after both of her parents had also previously converted to Judaism during her childhood. She was a student activist in the Open Hillel movement on campus, has been a digital editor at Lilith Publications, and has spent years working in left-wing politics and the labor movement. Amelia Dornbush currently works in communication for a nurses union in Michigan, but it's important to note that her views and opinions here are her own. In her free time, Amelia Dornbush tries with varying degrees of success to write, learn Yiddish, and volunteer on a goat farm. We're thrilled to hear this amazing story. So, Amelia Dornbush, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we're well into this series of episodes looking at the topic of conversion to Judaism. And one topic that's kind of come up here and there is, should we be saying converting to Judaism, convert, Jew by choice, something else? And we have been waiting for you because we know that you have strong feelings about this. So could you just start with why you really don't like the terminology that a lot of people seem to like and be urging us to use, which is Jew by choice?
So, God, I think it was probably 2015, 2016. I wrote an article for Lilith magazine called Why I Hate the Phrase Jew by Choice.
Amazing title. Direct, clear,
I mean,
no
it
confusion.
was slightly clickbait, but it is nevertheless true. It is nevertheless still something I feel all these years later. Fundamentally, I just felt like it never fit me. The question of choice in Judaism is much more complicated than the phrase Jew by choice makes it seem. The phrase Jew by choice sort of assumes that there's two categories, right? Like we don't break through the binary of convert, non-convert. It just redefines what the categories are. Jews who made a choice to be Jewish and Jews who did not make a choice to be Jewish. And I just didn't feel like this accurately reflected my experience of embracing Judaism. And I also think that there are plenty of people who would halachically be considered Jewish, who have made choices in their life, sometimes passively, and are no longer viewed as Jewish either by themselves or by society as a whole. And so I just felt like this binary that the term was creating did not work. In general, I have a hard time with binaries. Having Jew by choice versus non-Jew by choice be the binary by which we delineate people who have like undergone a Beit Din, which is the sort of formal panel of rabbis that decides whether or not someone who's approaching the group for conversion is accepted or not. Having it choice be the marker where we draw the line, where we draw the boundary is not helpful, and that it obfuscates more than it clarifies.
By the way, I know you didn't really mean this, but you put a really interesting term in the lexicon that perhaps we can talk about later, which is the non-Jew by choice. I think you meant somebody who was a Jew by not choice, in other words, somebody who thinks of themselves as a Jew by birth or whatever. But I'm also fascinated by the idea of a non-Jew by choice, because that kind of accords well with a lot of the ways that Jews see the world.
I know some of those folks.
Exactly, right, exactly. Anyway, before we dig deeper into the specifics of the question about what we should call folks, this really comes out of your quite fascinating story about how you became Jewish. And sometimes I hear a story like that and I'm like, wow, that's kind of a unique story. We should really share that interesting, unique story. But then I know from a lot of experience that you think something is a unique story. So it's actually really helpful to get it out there because people will say, oh my gosh, that's me. So can you share a little bit about your story?
Gosh, I think I'm going to start when I'm a toddler. So I don't actually have any direct memories of this. This is my dad's story more than mine, but I was young enough that I've grown up knowing this, right? So my dad found out when I was a toddler that his father had been born Jewish and raised Jewish to an early age, and then basically was sent off, I think, to Christian camp and told very directly to hide his Jewish identity. I should say here, my family, on this side of the family, in Atlanta, multiple generations of Jews in Atlanta. And my grandfather's telling of it, he was basically told, like, if the Nazis make it to the US, you have to convince them you aren't Jewish, would rehearse interviews with SS officers at a very young age in his bed, trying to convince them that he wasn't Jewish. And just at a very early age, developed this deep, deep-seated fear of Judaism, of anyone finding out he was Jewish. And he hid his identity. And my father, growing up, had no idea really that he was Jewish, except also it is actually very hard to hide an entire culture. It is not as simple as just one day deciding to become Christian and then wiping away one's entire cultural past. And so, my grandfather would go to, around Christmas time to his Aunt Mimi's house, and there would be a really cool candle holder. And Dad didn't quite get why there were so many like different little candles on the candle holder and why it was different every time. But that was just how it was. Aunt Mimi had the weird candle holder. And he'd go to a funeral and it'd be this language he didn't know. And a friend of his wanted to know why the Dornbush name was on the wall of the temple, which is this very old Reform congregation in the city of Atlanta. But Dad just didn't think a ton of it, right? Like they'd go to Saul's, which is the Jewish bagel shop, as a bagel shop, and just until one day, someone who is in the Atlanta Jewish community, Dad described him as a mocher, which is kind of like a muckety muck, like a kind of big deal, just sort of decided enough was enough. And someone needed to tell Kurt Dornbush about his heritage. And so sat him down and was basically like, I want to talk to you about the Colonel and Claire, which was how he referred to my great-grandparents, my grandfather's parents. And through the course of that conversation, it became very clear to my father why Aunt Mimi had that candle holder, why that funeral had been in that language he didn't know, why the Dornbush name was on the wall of the synagogue of his friend. His entire father's side of the family was Jewish. And so Dad found that out and basically asked my grandfather, why didn't you tell me? And My grandfather's answer was basically that he was very afraid. And so my dad dropped it. It stayed semi-dropped up until I was 13. And I had friends who were Jewish, and 13 is bar and bat and b mitzvah time. And so dad ended up in synagogue because one of my friends was experiencing her bat mitzvah. And for him, it was just this epiphany moment. He understood who he was in life, who he had always been in life. It made his life make sense to him when he was in synagogue. And at that point, he decided he was going to convert to Judaism. He went to one rabbi turned it down, went to another rabbi, and then began the process. So I've kind of been interested in Judaism then. I was sort of interested when my dad was converting when I was 13, but I was also just like an avowed atheist and very proud of being an atheist, and like didn't quite have the nuanced understanding of like the intersection of culture and literature and like argumentation, and like certainly had no clue what the Talmud was or anything along those lines. So I went to synagogue a little bit with dad, was like, meh, not for me. Dad converted. I did not. Shortly thereafter, my mom was like, my husband's Jewish. I should probably learn something about Judaism. Did one of those, I think, semi-iconic like Judaism 101 courses. Mom had always been alien, not always. She had a lot of questions when she went to Episcopalian religious school and actually got kicked out. But she didn't know she was kicked out because her mom didn't want to tell her, but they got too tired of her asking a bunch of questions. And so my grandmother told her that the religious school was canceled, and that was why mom couldn't go back anymore. And mom found out later as a teenager that she had actually been kicked out of the class. So mom had like been interested in religion, been interested in asking questions, hadn't encountered a place that was supportive of that, went into the Judaism 101 course. It really resonated with her, and she ended up converting as well. So now I'm like 13, 14, maybe 15. Judaism, rather than just sort of passively being in my life through whatever sort of cultural traditions had like carried on semi-subconsciously, was now very actively in my life. Like mom wanted to do Shabbat dinner on Fridays. Mom wanted to do Passover together. And like they had Rosh Hashanah, they had Yom Kippur, and I was like a rebellious teenage atheist and like would pointedly remain very silent during all of the prayers. And those were my teenage years, right? Like I lived in a Jewish household. I invented this riddle for myself because I thought it was very funny. Or I was like, I have a Jewish mother, I have a Jewish father, I'm a member of a synagogue because the temple did family memberships. How am I not Jewish? When I was 17 or whatever, I thought this was very clever. And then now that I'm 30, I look back on it and I actually think it's a valid question, right? Like was I not Jewish then? I wouldn't have identified that way. And my parents would never have had the gall to identify me that way if I didn't want to be. And, you know, when I'm 16 and this entered my life when I was 13, it didn't feel like I had been raised Jewish, really. But now that I'm 30, I don't really remember a ton of what it's like to be much younger than 13. I have some memories, obviously, but the more pronounced ones are my later years. It suddenly doesn't seem so clear to me whether or not I was raised Jewish.
So this is amazing. And what I love is A, you starting from toddler, and B, that the first part of the story is about your non-conversion. So we've talked about Jew by choice and non-Jew by choice and Jew by non-choice. We're gonna get back to that. But talk to us about the point where you yourself, not just your parents, took that next step.
When I went to college, I went to a small liberal arts school outside of Philadelphia called Swarthmore. And I was going through a really, really rough patch. And I wasn't really sure where to turn, what to do, where to go. And it was high holiday season. And I certainly knew about the high holidays from my parents, right? At this point for years. I thought that maybe the process of tshuva, which is sort of repentance, the word means return. It's much more messy and complicated than that, but that's sort of a quick definition of it, might be useful for me. It might help calm down my brain. Also, candidly, the food was better at Hillel than it was not at Hillel. It was home cooked. It was better than the dining hall. So the combination of the food and like some real desperation on my part got me to kind of overcome all of my obstacles and set foot in Swarthmore Hillel, which was a wonderful, welcoming, supportive space. And I observed the high holidays that year. I kept Yom Kippur. I fasted. I felt a great sense of relief afterwards. And then I continued to go to Shabbat regularly and consistently throughout all of it, kind of insisting that I wasn't Jewish, but was just sort of there. And then at some point, and I can't really tell you when or why, I realized I had stopped thinking of myself as like aggressively not being Jewish and started just thinking of myself as being Jewish. And when that point arrived, I kind of think most people at Swat Hillel like even thought of me as Jewish, as I was adamantly insisting I wasn't. But when I realized I was viewing myself as Jewish, many other people were viewing me as Jewish. There was no reason not to undergo the formal process. And that was the moment that I chose to formally convert. I remember at the time, at some point sort of during the process of conversion, actually feeling very resentful that I needed to convert. I went through the conversion in the end, and I'm really, really glad that I did. I don't think it was the moment that made me a Jew, but it was a moment of proclaiming to myself and others what Judaism meant to me, what my values were. Going into the mikveh felt like a really transformational experience. I don't think the transformation that was happening was becoming a Jew versus not becoming a Jew. I think the transformation that was happening was like self-consciously owning and proclaiming my Judaism.
So I want to dwell in this Jew by choice question again. Not that we should keep on hearing elements of your personal story because it's beautiful. The beauty of it isn't that, wow, 3 people who weren't Jewish became Jewish and score 3 points for the Jews. The beauty is that it sounds like each of you, I am moved by the fact that it actually was each of you individually at different points who felt called to this. That's not to disparage or dismiss families who convert together and that's how they feel called. But there's something really powerful about how it was your dad for a certain set of reasons. Then there was some time that passed. It was your mom for a different set of reasons. Then there was some time that passed and it was you for a third different set of reasons. I think that's incredibly cool. But I do want to dwell in this choice question. I want to dwell in it for a few reasons. One, you're an organizer. And I think it is worth thinking with a little bit of an activist hat and tying this to some other things. It does not surprise me that a person who is involved with organizing struggles with a framework of choice. For the last few decades, I think there's been, between various sort of liberal approaches and more leftist approaches, there's been serious questions about whether choice is the operating framework we want to run with in terms of our aspirations for American society or broader society. And I think for a long time, we had words like pro-choice, and we still do, where folks would anchor reproductive rights on the idea that it is a choice that people should have. There has been some movement to make the core word of reproductive health advocacy not pro-choice, but rather pro-abortion or just talk about reproductive justice, reproductive health. Because there's been a sense that maybe when we talk so much about choice and imply that everything is just about doing what's right for you, making choices, applying to you, you can miss certain things that actually are about justice, about rights that apply across the board or should apply across the board to everyone. And so I'm interested in whether that is sort of lurking here in your struggles with choice. If it's not, just say it's not. But I'm curious about that. And the other side of it is, I'll be honest, part of my issue with the dichotomy of Jew by choice and Jew by birth is that it erases the ways in which Jews by birth choose to be Jewish. It is in fact possible to be born to all Jewish parents or ancestry and say, you know what, I'm not Jewish. That's what we were talking about before with the not Jew by choice. We could say, what traditional Jewish law says, they're wrong, they're incorrect about their self-identity. I don't really want to say that. I don't think that I'm Jewish simply because of my birth. Jew by birth does not accurately describe me. Can you talk to us a little bit more about choice? Does it tie to some of those broader political frameworks and the ways in which this might be a disservice to all the sides of the equation?
Absolutely. I think in posing that question, you really zeroed in on just sort of 2 components of what grates me about this sort of terminology, right? The first is sort of more intellectual and political in a way. And I think the analogy you did around abortion rights is actually spot on, right? I think part of why pro-choice became so popular in terms of framing is people were afraid that if you just said abortion, that people would backlash against it and that it would be stigmatized. And so they tried to sort of recast what was going on in a way. Maybe it was helpful, but also maybe it really wasn't. Abortion should not be stigmatized, right? And part of what I feel like is going on with the phrase Jew by choice here is it kind of leans into some of the stigmatization of the phrase convert. If you're going to have a problem with converts, you're going to have a problem with Jews by choice as well. Rebranding it as something else, I don't think changes sort of the root issue here. I think the other part, though, and Lex, you alluded to this, is I just don't think it works. My grandfather unambiguously, halachically, according to religious law, is considered a Jew. But he's not Jewish. As a young child, due to circumstances, we can all be empathetic towards it. But he made a choice to denounce Judaism very, very proactively and repeatedly over the course of his life. He's not Jewish. He is not viewed by society as Jewish. He does not view himself as Jewish, right? And so halachically, yes. Societally, personally, no. And likewise, for me, halachically, most people who are Orthodox would say I'm not Jewish, right? I had a Reform conversion. My mother was not born Jewish. When my mother had me, she was not Jewish. She is now. Therefore, I'm not a Jew. But I am Jewish, and my grandfather isn't. The other component of this, and I alluded to this in my article, but from the time where I said, okay, I'm thinking of myself as Jewish, people seem to view me as Jewish, I should just make this official. And the point when I actually emerged from the mikveh, which is the Jewish ritual bath that you go into as part of the conversion process, I had this moment. Basically, someone had looked up my parents, assumed I was Jewish, made judgments about me. It was a small moment of anti-Semitism in my life. And I was just very upset about it. And I had this thought pop into my mind. I was like, God, I wish I wasn't Jewish. My life would be easier right now in this moment if I was not Jewish. And then I was like, wait a second, I haven't actually converted. Halachically, I'm not Jewish. I could simply not be Jewish. And I thought about it, and it just felt so wrong and so alien to me. Somehow along the way, partially through choices, also partially not through choices, right? My parents' decisions to convert were not ones that I made. I had become Jewish in the eyes of other people and in my own eyes, and choice had something to do with it, but it wasn't all of it. Judaism was chosen for me and chosen by me in some sort of messy bundle that's too hard to sort of unentangle.
Yeah, and this really speaks to me because I was born to two people who were Jewish. And I think that there was a point in my adult life, late in my adult life, where I probably could say that I made an active choice to be Jewish, or to at least make Judaism a really central and important part of my life. But like you're talking about, much earlier than that, I felt this sense of, yeah, this is who I am. It was more a sense of sort of making peace with the reality that was. And it's not because my parents were Jewish and I was born that way. It was because I realized that for some reason it had become so defining of who I was that had nothing to do, or not much to do with my parents. It had to do, certainly it had to in the sense that it started a chain of events, and I wouldn't have had certain experiences had I not been born into this family, probably. But that wasn't really, it wasn't that I said, ugh, I now look back at my, like you say, toddlerhood, and I was Jewish all along, and what can I do? And it's my cross to bear, so to speak. But it wasn't that at all. It was saying that, there were things that happened in my teenagerhood, in my 20s, that I realized kind of firmed things up. So I guess that I'm curious to have you think a little bit more. Lex is raising this idea that there are people who choose to be Jewish who weren't born Jewish. There are people who were born Jewish who potentially could choose to be not Jewish, which we all affirm, and that in the face of ideas of Jewish law that say, actually, we don't acknowledge conversion away from Judaism, and we don't agree with that. But there's also this other piece that says, both for people who were not born to Jewish parents and for people who were born to Jewish parents, that actually there's something else that's other than choice. And I'm just really interested in your possibly teasing that out even a little bit more. And then the question that emerges from that is what should we have as opposed to or along with a kind of traditional conversion idea? Is there maybe some other ceremony that maybe everybody should have at a certain point or multiple points in their lives that kind of say, okay, this is who I am? Or do we not really need a ceremony? But you talked about your own ceremonies being really meaningful. And part of me feels like when I heard you say that, I was like, maybe I would like to have that ceremony.
Starting with this question of sort of choice or non-choice, a unifying thread really between both of my parents and me and our coming to Judy, like accept ourselves as Jews, right? Is this notion of home. Like when Dad went to the synagogue, he felt like he had come home and sort of understood his life in a new way, in a very literal sense for him, like pieces that never made sense clicked into place. I think Mom also very much felt like she had found a spiritual home. Same for me. Part of what I encountered when I went to Swarthmore Hillel was Reconstructionist inflected Judaism, which resonated much more with me. No disrespect at all to the Reform movement, but sort of the Reconstructionist brand of Judaism really sits with me quite well. And it also felt like a home. And one can choose to leave one's home. And also one doesn't, I think, fully get to choose what home feels like entirely. And that, I think, is kind of, for me at least, at the crux of this discomfort with choice. Like there's so many factors, societal, cultural, history, like every sort of moment and experience that lead towards something feeling like a home. There's a component of choice for everyone in that, whether you were born to Jewish parents or parents who were Jewish at the time or not. Everyone has choices to make regarding how they're going to make their home, what home is. And also there are components that are mapped onto us that we don't have any say over. Do you choose your home? And the answer is yes. And the answer is also no. And I think that's true for everyone, whether you were born to parents who were Jewish at the time or not. And sort of the element of like how much choice and decision making, it's much more of a spectrum than it is a binary. As to the other part of your question about ritual, the way in which I conceive of it, which isn't to say this is the right way or the only way, is that there's sets of Jewish rituals people go throughout their life. I did not have a Jewish naming ceremony when I was born. I did not have a bar mitzvah. What I had was a beit din and a mikvah. And I am very much okay with that. It's possible when I'm 36, like double chai, I might do a bat mitzvah for myself for fun, but it would be a very different ceremony with fully different meanings than what it would have meant when I was a 13-year-old. What happened to me when I was 13 is my parents made a choice to bring Judaism into our household. That was not my choice. That was not me choosing to go down a path of Jewish adulthood. That was my parents as adults setting our house kind of by accident down that path. I think I'm okay with everyone having different experiences. Everyone's always going to have different experiences. Some people go to day school. Some people go to Ramah. I didn't do either of those things. I studied classical Hebrew in college, though, and got to have the experience of really wrestling with and proclaiming for myself what Judaism means to me. And I'm very grateful for that. Not that that was my bat mitzvah exactly. It was at a different point in time. There are different ceremonies, but that's part of how I became the exact kind of Jew that I am today. And so I'm good with having messy, complex myriads of rituals that different kinds of Jews experience at different points in their lives.
So I am always, when we're recording, thinking not from a resentful place, but from an interested place. What are the possible angry emails we could get from this episode? And I think that one possible angry email, and I'm not saying angry email as as a dismissive thing, we love your angry emails and they often push us and provoke us and help us fill gaps in our podcast. But I'm recognizing that one could listen to this episode and say, well, Judaism Unbound, they had an episode where they really critiqued the term Jew by choice. There's not an episode where they critique the term convert. And there's also potential issues with it. And so I'm wondering, Amelia, since you are a skilled, persuasive speaker, can we also bring some of the slippery sides of the term convert? And I'll say a little bit, I don't want to imply that the Judaism Unbound endorsed position is that Jew by choice equal bad, convert equal good in terms of the words we use. When I talk about this, I tend to say both because I'm aware that in a given space, somebody will really dislike Jew by choice, somebody will really dislike convert. But when I think about convert, I think one of the struggles many people have for whom that term feels incorrect for them is that they don't actually feel that they underwent to convert, right? It is a term with scientific meaning where a thing goes from X to not X. It becomes different. And for some people, what is happening, and some of the language you used I sort of hear this way. It's a finding of something that is already the case. It's not necessarily changing from a thing that one wasn't to a thing that one now is. For people that want to say, my journey from whatever I was before to Jewish, that was sort of an alignment. That was a realignment of something that was already the case. And there's a tension there because I think that's some people's stories and not everybody. For other people, they might say with equal passion, it's important to me that I was, Christian to start or Muslim to start or Buddhist to start, and I actively became a different thing. I actually don't want to erase that. But so can you talk a little bit about the term convert? Because my guess is you don't just think that's perfect. It's a perfect term that works. Can you give us a little more layers there?
Yes. And I mean, I can even do this from my own perspective, right? Which I think you alluded to, right? Convert implies you're going from something to something else. And I think the question of like, what did I convert from before I went into the mikveh? I still grew up in a Jewish household from 13 on. I guess you could go back before 13, maybe, and say like we were like secular sort of Christian hegemony types. What is implied in terms of convert, right, to argue against it is there's a point A, there's a point B, and you're going from one to the other. Like, I think that that's a very fair critique of the term. I think you had another guest on in the same miniseries, David Walensky, who made a point that I thought was quite interesting and very much resonated with me personally, that when David initially underwent a conversion in the conservative movement, he used conversion as a noun rather than as like a verb. And
underwent a conversion as opposed to convert to Judaism.
Yes. And to me, like, sure, it's kind of clunky, but that to me feels more true. I have no shame in the fact that I got to experience Beit Din. I feel a little lucky for it. But that still feels more like I experienced a Beit Din, I experienced a mikveh, I underwent the conversion process. I might even go as far as to say, like, all of that feels slightly more comfortable to me than the verb, like, converted, because that brings up questions that I don't really know how to answer. What did I convert from? It's complicated. I don't know. Somewhere combination between, like, being a resentful teenager and vague Christian hegemony secularism. So I think that there's a fair concern there. I just don't know that Jew by choice doesn't create more problems than it solves. I think if I had a magical wand and would get to sort of rewrite lexicon overnight, right? Just like tap, suddenly language gets to be exactly what I want it to be, and everyone hears what I need them to hear and vice versa. I think doing something with like the Beit Din, potentially the mikveh, that the process of the ceremony itself, and treating it kind of like how we talk about bar and bat mitzvot, right? Be mitzvot. Yes, there's the ceremony, but also you can refer to someone as a bat mitzvah or as a bar mitzvah, right? In that moment in time. I think if you were to do that with the Beit Din, right? Like, yes, I got Beit Dined, right? And like turn it into a verb, or like, yes, I was a Beit Dinner, right? And like turn it into a noun, like something along
That's amazing.
Lines.
Beit Dinner would translate as house of dinner,
and
which is an incredibly
like
appealing thing to be part of.
Exactly. And like people have very positive associations with food. I feel like it could help break through the stigma a little bit. But that to me, I feel like would be most helpful, right? It acknowledges a ceremony. The ceremony did something. What did that ceremony do for each individual person? That's probably going to be different, but the ceremony itself is fixed. And having our nomenclature, again, magic wand, I know it's much harder to rewrite language than that, but having our nomenclature be rooted in the physical act and then allowing people to map whatever meaning they have in their like unique, but also very shared journeys, I think would be more helpful than trying to be like, okay, the distinction is choice because choice is more positive than conversion is, or like rooting it for convert where there's this like intense question of before that just I think really doesn't resonate with a lot of people's experiences of like proclaiming a Jewish identity for themselves and having their communities proclaim it back to them.
Yeah, and I love the idea, and I know that some organizations are working on elements of this. We talked a little bit with Amichai Lau-Levi from Lab Shul in New York about new rites of passage for various parts of life that they're currently not Jewish rites of passage ceremonies. So they're talking about things like becoming a new parent, becoming an empty nester, retiring from your job, whatever those might be. But it also makes me think that maybe there should be another rite of passage, and maybe a number through life, where in some way you more actively affirm your identity as a Jew, and that's regardless of how you were born.
I think that's fantastic. When I was living in Brooklyn in New York, working for Lilith magazine, at some point I was like, I would rather be like a Yom Kippur treif ball kind of, like the anarchists used to have literal parties of treif on Yom Kippur. I thought that was great. I love
Of
that.
non-kosher food.
Non-kosher food, yes, thank you. Treif is food that is not kashrut, so pig, oysters, things like that. And there's this like current of Jewish radicalism that on Yom Kippur, which is the day of like that, you know, you're supposed to be fasting and not having anything, you would have the like least sacred food. I thought that sounded delightful. I love that rebellious energy. And so I made a very conscious choice to eat prosciutto and mozzarella sandwiches on my lunch break, sometimes at Lilith, because that seemed like the kind of Jew I wanted to be. When I left New York and moved to where I live now in Lansing, Michigan, eating treif suddenly felt different to me. It wasn't like I'm the rebellious kind of Jew and like living in this sea of Jewish community, and that's who I want to be. It felt more and more just like I was like, it felt less meaningful to me. And so I made a choice for a lot of reasons, but partially for this to keep kosher, and then entered into that phase of my life where now I keep kosher. And that's not to say that I won't again become like like delighting in treif and being Jewish through eating treif rather than being Jewish through keeping kosher. But that was a choice I made at a phase in my life. Multiple things sort of went on where I was like, I'm going to mark this transition by keeping kashrut now. Not as built out in terms of rites of passage as what you were describing, but I think it's stuff that we can do in communal and individual ways all the time, where we make these personal or collective affirmations of who we are and who we want to be.
I love that. And shouts to our, I think it was a bonus episode, either a bonus episode or a core episode, where we featured the Treifa Banquet 2.0, which we'll put in the show notes. There was this whole celebration. So I want to pivot a little bit to, you actually had a phrase at one point where you talked about it's tough to rewrite language. When we were talking about the terminology we use and how we might wave the magic wand and have new terminology, you did rewrite some language related to your conversion. When you had that actual moment, you looked at the affirmations of, or I think the terminology is declarations of faith that were there in the Reform movement, or maybe at the time there was only one main option. Now there's two, I believe, and we'll put those in the show notes. And you didn't love them. And so you said, I'm going to write my own, which is exactly what we want Judaism Unbound people to do, is to be looking at our inherited rituals and say, like, this doesn't work, we're going to recreate them. But it's especially chutzpahdik and awesome for somebody who is on that precipice and not seen yet by everyone else as official to take that step. And so, I want to like compliment that you had that chutzpah. It surprises me zero. Again, you're an activist, and you've touched on all sorts of ways in which you're happy to be radical. But can you talk about both like what you looked at and felt frustrated by with the traditional declaration of faith that the Reform movement uses, and sort of what you created for your ritual?
The Reform oath, which I viewed very much as like a loyalty oath at the time, I had like the most negative reaction to. There were two real pieces of it where I was like, I can't say this. Like, I cannot just sort of like grin and bear this, right? One was sort of an affirmation very explicitly about the state of Israel. I'm like very proudly a diasporic Jew. I feel like I have a sort of Bundist, which is sort of these socialist Jews in the 20th century attitude towards Zionism. They were not fans. I very much identify sort of with that kind of cultural affect. Does not work for me. So that was part one, it was just sort of directly against my political values. Part two was, there's a part of it, and I feel like this really speaks to a lot of the anxieties present in some parts of sort of mainstream Judaism about how you were going to raise your kids. And again, I was young, and I was like, I can't promise about how I'm going to raise my children. That's a decision. I like talking again about choice and like what you get to make and what someone else gets to make. The decision of how to raise a child is not one that someone gets to make alone. That has to be in conversation with someone else. And there wasn't anyone to have the conversation with. Like, it turns out that the person who I was dating at the time would go on to become my husband, but neither of us knew that was going to be the case then. And we shouldn't have had that conversation. It would not have been appropriate for us to have decided this at that point in our lives. I could not ethically or morally promise how I was going to raise my kids in isolation. So those were just sort of two things that I was like, I cannot make this oath. And the other parts just weren't that compelling to me either. Like, it did not to me, it felt like the language in that was a reflection of the anxieties that sort of mainstream Jewish life had about like Jewish continuity and the Jewish future and like, oh my God, will our kids be Jewish? And like, that just was so far removed from what Judaism was about to me. It felt wrong in addition to being something that just like I couldn't commit to. So I wrote my own instead because, you know, I thought it'd be fun. I knew some Hebrew. I have it, I still to this day, I have it framed in my office. And I found it very helpful as like a guide stone and a reminder of who I want to be in the world and how intertwined that is with my Jewish identity. The way it's framed, it's 3 different versions of conveying the same concept. I feel like I thought that was really profound at the time. I can't remember why I did. I guess I just couldn't decide on the Hebrew. And so it's like 3 different ways of writing it. All right, so I'm going to read the last of them in Hebrew and then translate it. So it goes as follows. Ani elech b'derech Adonai, which translates to I will walk on a road of God. And you know, elech obviously like derives from a similar word to halacha, but it's walking. And, you know, it was the easiest way to convey that concept. But what I was walking on, I did not want to tie, like the physical thing that I walked upon, I did not want to tie that to halacha. So rather than using one of the nouns that had the same root, since Hebrew is a root language, I chose derech, which had a different root to sort of have that bit of delineation, right? The next one is ani eavek Im Adonai, which means I will wrestle with God. And here I really wanted to use the word of wrestling that Jacob has with the angel and that iconic scene where Jacob then becomes Yisrael. That to me like encompassed so much of my relationship with Judaism. Sometimes it's an embrace, kind of on an act of faith. Sometimes it's a deliberate rejection of. But that wrestling component, that verb and that scene with Jacob and the angel, to me also encompassed sort of the core of how I viewed Judaism, how I viewed my Judaism, and what I was pledging to commit myself to going forwards, right? It's a wrestling. It's not a simple obedience.
Yeah, and what I hear in that is 2 possibilities. One is that you're wrestling with God in a way that, like, God is the one you're wrestling against, in a sense. But the other way to read it is I'm wrestling with God, like God is on my wrestling team, and we're wrestling together.
Whoa.
Absolutely. Also love the idea of being on a wrestling team with God. I would hope we would have a pretty solid record together, but part of what happens as one moves through life and gets older, and, you know, again, I wrote this about a decade ago, is there are the moments where it seems really like you are wrestling against God and it is adversarial and like there's an entity and you're not sure you're on the same side. And then there are parts where you get in, you know, like actually just the other day I was out in nature and there's just this like deep sense of like kindness, right? And like embodiment in the world. And that could be God on your wrestling team where just everything seems to be working in harmony. And as you go through life, I feel like you're always going to be in that kind of push-pull of those moments. I love that verb. I feel like it really captures kind of the core of something that's important. And it's literally foundational, right? It's Jacob to Yisrael. It's foundational to our text as well. And then the last one was tzedek, tzedek erdof, which just is justice, justice. And the commandment, it shall you pursue, but I put it into the first person since I was proclaiming it. So a commitment to pursue justice.
And I always, when I translate tzedek tzedek erdof or erdof, I always say it as chase or run after. Like pursue is this abstract, it's like in your head, like I'll sort of pursue. It's like a pursuit, like an intellectual pursuit. Like the verb, yes, it can be that, but like it's pretty physical. It's like, I'm going to chase after, I'm going to like run after justice.
Yes. No, I mean, I think I might be mistaken on this, but I think it almost has like a connotation of like a hunt almost. Like it's something that you have to work towards finding in a very physical and embodied way. It's another great verb, right? And, you know, that for me, like is sort of the guide star, right? In terms of how I want to live my life. And sometimes, you know, it feels easier to do that. We're in moments where like, it feels like you can gain a lot. And then other times it feels really hard and like it's a slog. There's a quote from a man who recently passed away named Mike Davis, talking about socialism and, you know, trying to build a better world. And it goes, fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely. And to me, I feel like this verb kind of ties into that, right? Like in this, the chase, the hunt. Sometimes you're going to be running through briars and it's going to seem like you're never going to get there. Sometimes it's through a flat, open field and it feels so close. But always, no matter whether the terrain is difficult or the terrain is easy, you have to keep doing it. I became pretty involved in like political activism, and 2018, like it really felt like this tide had turned, right? Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got elected in New York. It just sort of seemed like we were always going to be on this interminable march towards a better and more just world. And then things happen that make it seem like that's not going to always be the case. There are genuinely moments where I feel a sense of despair and hopelessness, and I wonder if I should stop and just give up, I guess. And I don't quite know what I would do with myself if I did, but I'm sure it'd be very relaxing. And this commitment that I made resonates with me now, a decade or so later, as much as it did at the time. And it helps remind me to always keep going and to do so with these things, right? Like walk on a road of godliness. It doesn't need to be the halacha. It just needs to be a road of godliness. Wrestle against God, with God, but wrestle with questions as they arise. The other thing I think that's good about wrestling is sometimes you lose, right? Like sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And that this partially gives permission for that to be okay. But always, always, always walk towards, run towards, chase towards, hunt towards justice.
You made giving up sound so attractive, like it would be relaxing. It would be, it's like, I'm like, maybe I should give up.
Yeah.
It's a siren song. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that there are benefits to just sort of throwing the towel.
So this is a bit of a gear shift, but I do want to name, you and I met around this time that you actually, I think it was shortly after. I don't actually know where you were on the conversion process, but you became marked as officially Jewish. You underwent the process. I'm trying to be careful about language, but you became Jewish, and immediately within a year or two, not only were you Jewish, you were at the center of a national, to some extent international movement that was very controversial. And that's how you and I met. We were both part of this together. We were wrestling against some things and wrestling with some things. The movement was Open Hillel, and you at Swarthmore's Hillel were at the very epicenter of it. And I name that not just to like give you street cred, that is part of why, but also because you did something that I think is so hard and so admirable, which is you went through this conversion process. And I think often there's a sense of like, okay, I just became Jewish. I should chill for a bit, not rabble rouse too much against Jewish institutions. I get my bearings, and then maybe I'll eventually do some more of that rabble rousing effort. You immediately were in the fray. I think that's really great. And as somebody who was part of that movement, I think we benefited so much from having you and others who had been recent converts to Judaism or Jews by choice as part of the movement. So I guess I was curious to hear about that post period after the conversion. Like, you were at the center of this really controversial movement. Did you experience people saying to you, like, are you even Jewish? Like, you're criticizing Hillel, you're doing blah, 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 blah. Like, did you experience any of that? What was it like to be sort of freshly minted?
Didn't. And it would have been easy for people to, right? Like, this too. People loved hurling insults at us, right? Like, oh, you're just a self-hating Jew. And I was like, trust me, I'm not. Like, I've got that in my family history. I promise you, I'm not a self-hating Jew. This or that, we got called capos, like tons of insults were hurled, usually anonymously. But for that, really not. I think mostly not. And I think honestly, the main reason why not is people love the story too much. I think people found it really reassuring in a lot of ways that like you can have a brief lapse in Judaism in a generation and still it will continue. Like, I think part of what people find appealing about Zionism is it promises Lador Vador, generation to generation. And like, sure, I was not Zionist and in fact was challenging a lot of their core fundamental tenets, but I also like in the flesh promised Lador Vador, even if there was a gap. And so I think people found that reassuring enough. It was fine. Like, I didn't feel like it was that chutzpahdik. It was just sort of, we had this wonderful, open, accepting Jewish community at Swarthmore Hillel. the Hillel had these things called the standards of partnership, which set very strict rules about, who could
and still do.
Still do. God. Still talk about, like who you can co-sponsor with and who you cannot co-sponsor with, and like what you can say and what you cannot say. And it's, very black and white and unmessy. And it felt so much like it did not embody the values of the community that I was so proud to be a part of. We are open, we're an open Hillel, have the conversations, like wrestle like Hillel and Shammai, right? Like it always offended me that Hillel called themselves Hillel while they were not having that same sort of productive conversation like Hillel of the Talmud did. And God, we were in college, we didn't quite know how to do press, right? So we put out a statement, we put out a press release, and it by the end of it, like a couple of weeks passed, and like suddenly we're on the front page of the national section of the New York Times, right? And my mother was mortified because my pants were too low in the picture. And like, it's just like this whole thing. And we tapped into something that was very real and very widely felt, which was a desire to be able to own your own Jewish identity, own your own Jewish communities, decide, what you want to do for yourselves. The idea of declaring yourself as open and just simply being like, your rules that you say we have to follow, we're not going to follow them. We're publicly not going to follow them. It spread to a couple other campuses. I think I knew at the time, like, it was something people could criticize me for having converted and being involved in it. But it felt like such a continuation of everything that it just didn't feel that different. SWAT's Hillel's community had always been open and accepting. All that was changing it was we were announcing it.
Which is exactly how you described your own process in a certain sense. Like you were already a thing and then you were announcing it through ritual.
And the announcing matters, right? Sometimes it gets you hate mail. Sometimes the same thing can lead to other people announcing the same. The proclamation has some meaning to it.
So this is really reminding me of a text that I know we've talked about before in the podcast, but it's such a good one. I think it's really a central one, which is the story where Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of the early days of Rabbinic Judaism, and the Talmud says that he would have these admissions requirements, essentially, to be able to come into the study hall, and it was that your insides had to look like your outsides. But whatever he meant by that, there's this moment where he's removed from his position for a completely different reason, and they remove the guards from the gates. And then the Talmud says that people flooded in, and there's a debate whether they had to add 400 benches or 700 benches to accommodate all the people who flooded in. So then the story goes on and says that the very first thing, it says actually that they solved all the open questions that were on the table that day, meaning by bringing in all these new people, they were actually able to solve all these vexing problems that were on the table. But the only one that's described is the case of a person who wanted to convert to Judaism from the Ammonites, which is a people that the book of Deuteronomy says can never be Jewish, and their descendants can never be Jewish. And they figure out a way to let this guy convert to Judaism anyway. And what strikes me about that story is that basically it's like if you open up the doors, more people come in, and the first thing they want to do is open up the doors even wider and let even more people come in. And the reason why I was thinking about that was because of how you were describing Swarthmore Hillel. But it sounds like a place that basically affirmed that you were Jewish before you thought of yourself that way. And that in a way, it kind of gave you, and I imagine many others, a notion of what Judaism is all about, that it's very, very open. And that was very, very affirming to people. And then they ran into the buzzsaw of the organized Jewish community, which says, actually, we're not. And that can be experienced as shattering and disappointing. And it can also be experienced as a spur to action to say, well, actually, I don't think that the Judaism that you're putting out there is the right kind of Judaism. So we're going to say that it's Swarthmore Hillel Judaism that's going to take over the world. I just sort of wonder whether there's something here. I mean, I think it's both the fear of certain people that say, yeah, if we open the doors, more and more people are going to come in. They're going to like dilute Judaism or something. They're going to not hold our values, and then Judaism is not going to be Judaism anymore. And there's a piece of that's true. Not the dilution piece. I think they'll actually make it better, but yeah, they're going to change it. You can look at that and say that's a scary negative thing, and you can look at that and say that's wonderful.
So Swarthmore Hillel, right? Like we or I don't know if this is still the case. Again, it's been a decade. It could have a totally different culture now. But when I was there, we had rabbinic student interns who were from RRC, which is the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And I really think part of why the Judaism that I encountered in college resonated with me so much more than sort of the Judaism that was imported into our household when I was 13 is in part sort of the Reconstructionist component, right? So the founder of Reconstructionism, a guy by the name of Mordechai Kaplan, believed in Judaism as being a civilization that constantly kind of gets built and rebuilt and changes over time, like a construction project, right? Kind of like Theseus's ship, where you put in a piece, something else changes. When is it the ship? Is it always the ship, etc.? And I have, with the passage of time, started to view conversion much more as like a citizenship than I think other religions' conversion processes are like, right? Like Judaism, it's hard to define. It's not just a religion. It's not just, it contains many different cultures, right? But it also has those pieces as well. The thing about citizenships is places change. Places should change. Nothing should be eternal and fixed forever. You don't want that. We shouldn't want that. And also, like in any country, right, which I don't think country is quite the right parallel here, but like you have those nativist strands, right? You have people that backlash against that and backlash against that hard. And I think that sort of the dynamics and the conversations and the tensions and the concerns around like language and all of this that you see tied up within the process of conversion, we could go with baked dinners, try to make it happen, is those kinds of anxieties manifesting. But rather than manifesting in a specific state with like very firm borders, right, like a very 20th century conception of a nation state, it's happening in something that's not as well defined. But I would agree with Mordechai Kaplan. It's something that constantly gets reconstructed and grown over time. It's a civilization. And of course that changes. That has to change. But also there will always be backlash to that.
That's an amazing way to close this episode. Amelia Dornbush, we're so grateful to have you on. Thanks for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As Dan mentioned at the top, we have 5 new Onion Shiva courses being offered this fall. They'll be beginning in early October, and you can register for them now. We're spotlighting Yoshi Silverstein's class, Embodied Jewish Transformation, which, if you didn't hear Dan give a little overview at the beginning, you can rewind to the first couple minutes. He gives a window into that amazing class. There's also 4 other classes taught by the amazing Tamar Cami Yankowski, Rachel Rose Reed, Eliana Light, and Karen Aviv. So head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about each of these courses and register. And of course, we also want to close this episode by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you could head to judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all our others, learn more about us. And of course, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, and you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.